if the organisation is committed to more than it's capable of delivering, that is a problem. You need to start having decision makers who can unmake some of those commitments. We end up with these conflicting ideas of what progress looks like. And our plans of one view, our tracking systems of another view, the people doing the work of another view, the customer has their own view.
Yes.
What might they do with their liberated decision-making and communication capacity?
Welcome to the Strategy Meets Reality podcast. I'm your host, Mike Jones. Today I'm joined by Mike Burrows, author of Wholehearted and founder of Agenda Shift. In this episode, we unpack the core ideas of his latest book, from deliberately adaptive organisations to real role of relationships, participation and experience in navigating complexity and change. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you.
If you give me a bit of background, a bit of context, where you come from and what you've been up to.
I have a background in technology. I mean, most of my career in technology, in various places in investment banking for 10 years. I was an executive director at a leading investment bank, CTO of a risk management startup in the energy space, delivery manager on a couple of the UK government digital services at the time they were doing their exemplar projects, consultant, trainer, author, all those kind of things. And I've kind of been a bit of a journey, I suppose, starting with things that perhaps a bit more emphasis on process. My first book, Kanban from the Inside, it's not all about process, but that's starting in that sort of quite lean, flavoured approach to process. As when I was teaching Kanban, years ago, I was always encouraging people to think more organisationally, but didn't quite have the words to explain what I meant by that. And that's kind of been a 10, 15-year journey to actually put the flesh on the bones of that. And the latest book really is the.
I thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and I really want to dive into it because I can see so many synergies with system thinking, especially with viable systems model that you reference in there, and it really pulls at the tension that we find or the challenges we find with organisation, that they're too static and they believe in predictability, not set themselves to be adaptable. First of all, I'd love to claw at this idea of deliberately adaptive organisation. So what does that mean, and how can you apply it?
Organisations are full of, there are communication happening, networks of communication, reporting structures, decisions being made, both operational decisions, strategic decisions, and so on. And I just wish we used more of those signals as signs that, well, perhaps we're not quite structured quite right. Perhaps some of the relationships that we have, when I say relationships, I mean that very, very broadly, not just between people, not just between teams, but between things like different levels of scale in the organisation, between teams and teams of teams, for example, even between different aspects of the organisation, like how it does its work, how it coordinates, how it organises, how it strategises, all the rest of it. And this is where the viable system model comes in. Those might seem like abstract things, but it's actually very easy to identify them really at any scale of organisation. And if those aren't healthy and productive, you're going to be leaving a lot on the table. You're going to be wasting a lot of your communication capacity and decision-making capacity dealing with the consequences of things being not set up as really you would like. So that's an important aspect of being deliberately adaptive. It's using those signs, using all those signals to help actually encourage the organisation, to stimulate the organisation into adapting, and not seeing the organisation design in terms of like design with a capital D, where someone works out on paper what it should look like, and then that's an implementation plan. And that gets to the second aspect. And I think that's what's perhaps what's unique about this book in terms of how I treat VSM, viable system model, not as something that you design, that you draw out on paper, but something that starts with the experience of every participant in the organisation, or at least every participant that you can get in the room. And it's those different experiences that are the source of the organisation's adaptive capacity. It's by them communicating, by them having ideas, by them working with each other, making decisions and so on. That's actually how the organisation ultimately achieves anything, how it adapts to anything novel in the environment or opportunities that it might see, and so on.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. We know viable systems model works on different systems, and I've seen you play that out in your book, and you call it delivering, discovering and renewing.
Yes.
And what do you mean by that, and how do these interplay?
Well, that's the title of chapter 1, Delivering, Discovering, Renewing, and it's very subtly. I don't signpost. I explain that I'm approaching it differently, but I wait till chapter 3 before I make the real comparison between classic VSM and what I call the deliberately adaptive organisation. I'm really, respectful, faithful even to Stafford Beer all the way through. He was the creator of VSM, but I start from a slightly different place. And the place I start with is not that, we're in a factory where we're looking at producing widgets or whatever it might be, and we identify what are the productive activities of the organization and start with them, and that scopes the exercise. Instead, something that's much more suited to a 21st century organization, a digital organization, a digitally enabled organization, product-centric organization, a customer-centric organization, where delivery, discovery, and renewal go hand in hand. If you've worked in digital, you're doing those together all the time. You're not just delivering, you're using that delivery to help you better understand what you should be delivering. And at the same time, you are improving things. You're improving your capabilities, how you do things, and your platform, whether that's in terms of process or in terms of technology. So basically, if it makes an impact, makes a material impact on the environment or on the organization itself, to me, that is still work.
Yes.
And accounting makes a material impact on the outside world. HR makes a material impact on the outside world. So I don't start with, what are the productive activities of the organization? And by not starting there, you actually widen the conversation. And these different groups can still talk in terms of delivery, they can talk in terms of coordination, they can talk in terms of organizing, and you make the whole thing much more generative. I take you through a process that anyone can understand. It's actually not that difficult to do. To people who aren't practitioners, what I do seems easiest and obvious and natural. Getting people to talk to each other, and to agree certain things, but not to nail things down, but to agree where the challenges and the opportunities are. And so I'm sidestepping certain things that many practitioners would spend a lot of time on. And in the right circumstances, it's good that they do, but that's just not how I do it. And, if you do want to get to that adaptive thing, the adaptive capacity, if you do want to explore complexity, explore multiple perspectives, all those kind of things, you need a different set of tools for doing it. And that's what Wholeheartedly does.
Oh, that's good. And you brought some really interesting things there around actually the relationships between things.
Yes.
And I think that's when in organizations, and you picked up earlier around design, people draw it, and it really comes down to people draw boxes.
Yes.
And it's like, oh, this person reports to this. What they're not really getting at is the relationship between the different elements that really matter.
No.
How do you encourage leaders to start thinking about the relationships rather than our sort of traditional view of boxes and essential silos?
Partly it's by a change of language. I'm asking the question, is this relationship healthy and productive? And if you take you could take just two things, the work and its business environment. Is that a healthy and productive environment? Are customers benefiting in the way that we want to? Are we understanding customer needs in the way that we want to? And are we delivering in batches appropriate and so on? It's kind of a lean way of looking at it. But all these different models can prompt you to ask different questions about the relationships between things. When you make it a four-way relationship between the work, the customer, or the environment, how you coordinate, how you organize, then that's still only like half of the model or a third of the model, but it starts to get really interesting because the way you frame your commitments, your plans and so on, the way you coordinate your work, the way you actually do your work, and the way the customer thinks about the work may actually not really work well together. It's one reason for customer focus isn't only that's because it's the right thing to do and we get happy customers and all the rest of it. It's also because we end up with these conflicting ideas of what progress looks like. And our plans of one view, our tracking systems of another view, the people doing the work of another view, the customer has their own view. And by aligning on a more customer-oriented view of what progress looks like, you start to eliminate a whole set of problems, and you start to have those different aspects actually working more productively together, being in more balance with each other. And so that's an example on just one part of the model. And there are different ways, generically of understanding how things can get out of balance and what you might do with them. And there are some specific examples, and there are things that different bodies of knowledge bring to play as well.
You brought up a really good point there around, we call it divergence of thought.
Yes.
We want divergence of thought, not divergence of action. But
yes.
You've got to get that shared understanding of what we're looking at.
Yes. Well, you kind of want you want the right amount of agreement.
Yes.
And another imbalance, for example, is where the plans might be overly prescriptive. And you're actually denying the opportunity for the people doing the work to bring their expertise to bear, at the very least, and potentially denying opportunities for real innovation. So that's a problem. On the other hand, make it too ambiguous, then no one knows what they're going to get. So that becomes a problem. So this is why we need to collaborate, we need to cooperate, we need to sense make, all these different things, so that without necessarily specifying things, nailing them down, we can come to an accommodation that works, that's flexible, where the customer feels part of that conversation, and so on.
Touching on an interesting point around, I call it freedom of action. So leaders that, when they're trying to execute strategy, they obsess over, perfection, perfect Gantt chart or anything like that. And it removes all freedom. But then, like you said, you go the other way where actually there is no constraints, and it can start fracturing the organization because there's too much autonomy in that sense. How do you, advise leaders to balance that?
Yeah, I mean, partly that is respecting the different expertises that your workforce has, and there are going to be many areas where there are people that know more than you do about certain things, and how do you enable that to be brought to bear on the challenge? You hire smart people, you want them to think for themselves, but at the same time there are certain results that you want to achieve. The challenge, and it's one of the ultimate challenges of organisation, is for the strategy part of the organisation and the delivery part of the organisation. And I'm not saying there should even be different people, but there's certain conversations that happen around delivery. There are conversations that happen around strategy, and if they don't not just inform each other, but deeply understand each other, then people are going to make bad decisions. Strategy decisions based that are too separate from things like capacity, capability, and so on. You're going to have operational decisions that are made ignorant of what the organisation is really trying to do and where it hopes to get to, and so on. So some of the organisation's capacity has to be devoted into those two aspects of organisation: understanding each other, appreciating each other. Partly that's a state of mind, partly that is actually making sure the right conversations happen. So, for example, at the beginning of a piece of work, it's a great technique taught to me by a friend of mine, Philippe Gwenet. For this piece of work, do we need to coordinate over it, collaborate over it, or cooperate over it? Easy question.
Yes.
But to answer that question, you've actually got to come to some level of understanding about what's actually involved.
Yeah.
Only sufficient understanding to answer that question, and then if there is more understanding that needs to be had, that'll be obvious from the conclusion that you come to. If the conclusion is, well, our coordination systems are enough, if we do the obvious things, it'll come together at the right time, everything's good. If it's a cooperate answer, well, we'll need to break this down a bit, decide who's responsible for what, decide how things are going to come together, how we're going to track those pieces before they come together, that kind of thing. Or does it need to be a deeply collaborative process where something we don't yet understand is going to come out of our creative conversations, out of us working together, and so on and so on? That's a sense-making conversation. And, we need to make sure that the right people are in the room.
Yeah, I really like that. Just the simplicity of the questions, but actually it helps you sense make and, I suppose get that alignment in what you're trying to actually do. Because often we're in conversations where we think we're doing the same thing or aligned, but we're massively misaligned. And that creates friction.
Yes, it's a really clever question because we need to have just enough shared understanding. But at the beginning of the conversation, we don't know what even just enough means. By approaching it laterally with the coordinate, cooperate, collaborate idea, you're actually calibrating it as well.
Yeah. I really like it. And, in your book, you also talk about adaptive strategizing and mutual trust building.
Yes.
And I think that's that tension between the two, the bit about looking outside in the future,
yes,
understanding about the strategy, but then the ability to not only communicate that, but balance that tension with operations and primary activities of the organisation.
I mean, the mutual trust building, contextualizing as well as the one of the activities inside that. It really is making sure that those two aspects really do understand each other, and at every level of organisation as well. These things sort of become big the more you think about them. But there's some basic leadership practice there. Things like managing by walking around, for example. Actually noticing what's different. Noticing, well, that's a conversation I haven't had for a while. Noticing there's a stone I haven't turned over for a while. And that's a kind of quite sort of top down way of looking at it. But it's also about how open am I to having things being brought to me as well. Do we have systems that alert me when things aren't right, and so on, and not just making it all about the leader. When something's not right, do people naturally, first of all, know about it, and second, come together to do something about it? We need people to have the capacity to act and to bring other people in to act with them as appropriate. And as people start to act together, possibly you're even creating a new social structure as you do it. I mean, and this is why I say it's so important to bring things down to the level of the individual. Yes. That is where that and individual and relationships between individuals, because that's where that adaptive capacity lies as much as it does in those big meetings on strategy.
Yeah, I really like that idea. And you often see it in organisations where the leader or the leadership starts to become, or, not even just such leadership, but the people that are doing strategy-ish and the organisation become disconnected.
Yes.
Because they're not enabling that feedback loop. We often see it's red. All the signals are red.
Yes.
But miraculously, by the time it reaches the top, it's green.
Yeah, watermelon projects, I call it. It's not my idea, that term, but I love that one. Watermelon projects, red on the inside, green on the outside.
Yeah, but it's so true, and I see it all the time. And then also that you got a question last time that leaders really actually went down several layers of the organisation to understand what's going on, the difference between what they believe to be true and what's actually happening in reality.
Yes.
Because that can only help them when they go back to think about strategy. What inputs have I got? What's, like you said earlier, about the resources, capabilities to enable strategy?
Yes. If there is a magic cure for these things, often it is participation. There are no silver bullets, obviously, but the more that you can get people in the room that understand where we want to get to, understand what's possible, understand what we're currently committed to, the easier you make this. And when organisations are really stuck, you need people who can actually do something about each of those aspects. Perhaps unmake some commitments that are actually get in the way of what we really want to achieve. For example, and it takes in opening a whole new can of worms as well. As soon as you get people in the room to have these conversations, you are bringing different outside intelligence into the conversation as well, and you get to the whole thing about how you're organised actually has a massive impact on how you actually understand the outside world. So that the question that you started with, about are we setting up a mismatch between what we're planning and what we're actually capable of? Well, also we may be setting up a mismatch with what we're trying to do and what the world actually wants, and how the world will respond, and so on and so on. And so these things we need to bring much more closely, and we need to have much tighter feedback loops on these things, much more participation if we're going to avoid those kind of problems.
Yeah, and agree. When I look at strategy approaches, especially in the last 40 years, I would argue a lot of them are only inside focused. So they often start with the aspiration first.
Yes.
Yeah, which comes to your point about, are we doing the right things? What's happening? What's the current situation, external environment? And where do we then get value or get fit for the customers?
Yes.
How do you suggest that leaders actually turn that out so they're getting a bit of an outside in perspective?
Yeah. Well, I talk explicitly about inside out and outside in, and it's not that one is better than the other. It's that they actually need to work together. It's perhaps too glib to call it a virtuous circle, because if it was a virtuous circle, every organisation would be a runaway success if they cracked it.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps they're the ones that have cracked it, but we need to make sure that we bring them together properly. So inside out strategy, starting with the experience and capability of the organisation, and as we improve those, we create opportunities that might be leveraged externally, exploited externally. And there's outside-in strategy, where we start outside the organisation with our customers, our suppliers, our competitors, and everything else. Coming to a view on how we want ourselves to be seen externally, how we want to be positioned, with what products and services we're going to do that, and then working the implications inside. What does that mean for our products? What does that mean for the platforms from which we deliver those products? And actually joining the dots there is where the real power is, I think.
Yeah, I think again it's creating that balance between the two, and you can quite clearly see strategies that have been heavily weighted between one and the other.
Yes.
I would argue mainly from sort of just the inside perspective, because I've yet to see.
I just thought a really funny example where they did both, but they weren't connected.
Oh right, wow.
So it was, by one lens, it was a very marketing-driven organisation, and the engineering would be terrified about what the marketing director had just sold. On the other hand, from a technology point of view, the technologists were forever perfecting the platform. Only rarely did they generate something that would get the outside world excited. It's that disconnect was really fascinating.
You said you worked a lot in IT, and I know your background with Agile. From my perspective, I could see that as an easy trap for technology companies to fall in, because they've got engineers that are so focused on delivering the perfect platform.
Yes.
And then you've got people looking at what does the actual client want, and I could see that could be a real friction between the two.
Yes, and you get it internally as well. In enterprise IT as well. You get people that see technology as their fiefdom, and it's not enough about helping the business serve their customers, serving the business who are then serving their customers, and so on. I remember I actually left one. I did an internal move shortly after a new manager joined, who told us how great it was that we were going to be doing Java and the internet. I'm showing how old I am now. There was he gave a motivational speech where the business wasn't mentioned, the customer wasn't mentioned, and I just thought, and I was then still a pretty hardcore techie, but even so, I could see that was a problem. And if you want to give career advice to a technologist, is to get as close to the business as you possibly can. Well, that would have been my advice, 10 years ago. I think even now it might be even, understand your customers, understand their needs, understand their struggles, understand what progress looks like for them. I've been very influenced by job stories and so on in the last few years.
Yeah.
You start to understand the world and needs and struggles, then and progress. And I guess back to what I said before about progress. If we're measuring progress in those kinds of terms, it changes how we think about the work. And it changes how we think about learning and all these other things.
But I know you just triggered something in me about, it's not just tech guys or girls that are working on the program. It's other parts of the organisation. Like, you're thinking about, because we almost fracture ourselves. We've got HR, we've got our sustainability colleagues, we've got all these elements of the organisation that are talking about their strategy.
Yes.
And I do question, actually, are they close to the business, or are they looking at it from their worldview that is disconnected from the business?
Yes. I mean, I touch on that. That's a dysfunction, isn't it? When any part of the organisation, sees its strategy as more important than anything else, that is dysfunctional. I mean, I call it the tail wagging the dog. Where you see it where, for example, and this is not to diss accountants, but where accounting policies drive strategy, for example.
Yes.
Or HR have a particular view on the kind of people we should be recruiting, and so on. In a way, is somewhat inevitable. Much as we would love for everything to be truly cross-functional, not every team is going to have an HR specialist in it.
No.
It's not going to happen. And we can't expect delivery teams to become experts on all the legal implications of the HR-related decisions that they might take. Whether there is actually a reason. There is some real complexity in the real world, which is what that drives why we actually do have HR departments and accounting departments. It's not wrong that they exist. It becomes a problem when their power detracts from whatever the mission of the organisation might be, or that there is an unresolved tension between policies of different parts of the organisation.
Yeah, and you see this where decisions, and probably rightly so, why they've taken them, but they're starting to impact the ability of people, or changes the focus of people. So, for example, I've seen where finance have come in and said, we've got a reduced budget. So straight away, people aren't looking at it and going, well, what do I need to achieve? And then what choices do I need to make with this new constraint?
Yes.
They're now looking at it as, oh, I've got this budget, and that becomes their aim, and that's not their aim.
Yeah.
That's a constraint,
yes.
But it is not communicated in that way.
No, and the trouble with those sort of one size fits all policies as well is that at best they fit only one stage in like the product life cycle. Investing in a new idea is a very different thing to running a going concern and making sure that it is adequately resourced to meet the demands that the marketplace is going to impinge on it in the coming few months. Do we have the right provision of IT infrastructure to support the load, for example? I was actually had some real responsibility there in my UBS days on that question, or on a product that's sort of just we're keeping this on bare bones maintenance while the next generation comes through. Again, you're going to make some very different decisions about investment and spending in those situations. So it's making sure that the policies actually fit the where you are in the life cycle. It's one of a few examples in the book where I think we neglect the time dimension to our cost at times. Yes. And understanding things like customer life cycles and product life cycles actually gives us some more nuanced and appropriate set of policies, whether it's about how we staff up our teams, how we do budgets, or whatever.
Yeah. You see it as almost an act of trying to simplify things by setting standard policies, but actually you make it more complex.
Yes, exactly. And there's a general problem. We all do it.
Yeah.
When when we're at the stage of inviting solution ideas, I always ask for diverse solution ideas. And one way to make them more diverse, if you have an idea that involves everybody else, conforming to your policy, jumping through your hoops, come up with one where it's you making the first move, where it's you, trying to understand what everybody else needs, and so on. And that's really important. I mean, teams, given in the lack of better things to optimize for, teams, departments, HR departments, accounting departments, but I'm including those with technology teams, other teams in the business. They will optimize for their own convenience, and you can't blame them for doing it. It's the lack of an overriding goal, an overarching goal. Is perhaps the problem there. And if we can all point to some overriding goal that we are trying to get to together, then we will get to some more sensible policies, probably.
I think that's that idea of sort of coherence.
Yes.
And I think that's lost in time, because I can look back to Clausewitz, 200 odd, almost 300 years ago, and he talks about this and about how successful armies are the ones that have a coherence in what they're trying to do and minimize divergence of action against the common aim. But I do wonder how a lot of the wisdom from the past is sorely forgotten now.
Yes. It's funny. I've had this conversation with a few people. It seems like I've had a lot of joy in the last few years, sort of mining the 1970s. So Staffordshire is one example, but it seems like it seems from the 2020s like it was like the heyday of systems and organizational development, organizational psychology. A whole sort of thing. Complexity was just maybe a twinkle in people's eye. And there were some interesting things going on, and I wish more people took it more seriously. One problem that Agile has had is that it is grown like Topsy in the absence of theory. I think Agile was a great thing. I think it still has something to offer. And I'm not going to go into all of Agile's woes here, which are self-inflicted, I have to say. But the idea that you scale Agile by making the process bigger and more complicated flies in the face of the kind of theory that we're talking about today.
Yes.
And when you understand that things happen at different scales, and things happen naturally at each scale. But also, you need to have healthy and productive relationships between levels of scale. You start to worry less about the detail of the process, the number of boxes on the poster, and everything.
Yeah.
And you're changing that conversation. So I think some actual theory of organisation would be helpful. And some of the organisational psychology stuff is really helpful as well. Some of the stuff I talked about how things cohere socially even actually is very relevant when you're talking about adaptability, you're talking about business agility, and creating those, developing social capital in that way is, can be really important as well. And I give an example or two in the book.
Yeah, I like your idea. We talk about social capital. I think that's really, really good concept to think about.
There are really examples where we did we sold using people from different teams, and to start with, we were rubbish at it. I didn't know what this teaming thing was, but we cracked it and we solved that problem. And then months later, we solved a completely different problem, one that I hadn't sponsored. It just happened. And that's wonderful. And that wasn't designed on paper. Situations like that don't get designed on paper. They happen because we make them possible.
Yes.
And that's really what this is about. And what makes them possible is removing the things that make them impossible to a large extent.
Yes. Well, what do you think those things are that organisation put in place that make it impossible?
Yeah, classically, it's, if you start from a lean perspective, it's overburden, it's overcommitment, all those kinds of things. If you and this ties back also to the theory of back to the 1970s or even earlier. What's it called? The potential of redundant command or redundant potential command. McCulloch. Yeah. You need enough.
Yes.
I mean, I put it in more modern terms, but without enough. As I said before, without enough decision-making capacity and communication capacity in the organisation, those emergent things, those self-organised things, just aren't going to happen. People aren't going to notice that it's even necessary, and if they do notice, they're not going to bring in the other people that they need to get the thing to happen. All those lean things, I think arrogance of me, but reframing lean, even in terms not of eliminating waste, but into liberating those capacities. And then you can start thinking about what's the second order effects of liberating those capacities. If my team actually has the capacity to manage itself properly and the capacity to innovate and to adapt, that's reducing the burden on the surrounding organisation as well.
Yes.
And what might they do with their liberated decision-making and communication capacity?
Yeah, that's really good. You see this with, at an individual level, humans only have so much cognitive capacity. It's only so much they can do.
Yeah.
Organisational level, the same. There's only so much capacity. And often when you look at what are the outputs that you're expecting from this team, and then what the resources that you've given them to produce those outputs.
Yes.
There's often a huge mismatch there.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's one of those between levels of scale things, and there's a whole load of related dysfunctions around that. So that what you described, the cybernetics people call the resource bargain. Not being struck appropriately. But people give different names to that. But there's a whole load of sort of similar things about means and ends, micromanaging, tampering. There's a whole load of dysfunctions, setting people up for failure by making them responsible for things at the next level of organisation up, at which they don't have appropriate influence. As those are all very, very familiar examples.
Yeah.
And often you realise that the problem doesn't lie where the pain is felt. And that's important because you're going to fix it. It's no good blaming the system that's suffering for the suffering if the suffering is inflicted from somewhere else.
Yeah, it's looking at adaptive organisations, and you talk about that burden, that load. And for an organisation to be adaptive, they need to be able to deliver what they need to deliver now, but also understand what they need to change and have the capacity to change.
Yes.
But we often overburden them. That means they're going to deliver what they need to do today, because that's what we're incentivizing them to do.
Yes.
And they don't leave any capacity for the adaptation.
Well, I think that's why organisations sometimes they either grind themselves into the ground or they end up in some kind of crisis, because as things get worse, they actually take away their capacity to think about how they get out of their problems.
Yeah.
And they get into a vicious cycle in that case. Overburdening is a problem. Pretty easy to deal with. Just decide not to work on two things at once.
Yeah.
I'm simplifying, obviously. Overcommitment's a bit harder, and especially when that comes from the top. If the top is telling you need to work on three things at once, that's a problem.
Yes.
If the organisation is committed to more than it's capable of delivering, that is a problem. And that's where you need to start having decision makers who can unmake some of those commitments if we're going to do it. And that's something I have seen happen, I have to say. I'm not just talking hypothetically.
Yeah. I totally agree. Another issue or thing we keep hearing at the moment around flat organisations, because you talk about different levels of scale.
Yes.
And then you keep hearing about this bossless organisation, flat organisations. What's your view on that?
I think, as with all of these things, it's a simplification. And as I described, the flatter the organisation is, it creates an opportunity for self-organisation, because self-organisation is creating organisation. So that sounds like it's going away from the flat organisation thing. And I think, I don't want to split hairs here. I think the more important thing is actually get good at it. I described where, a situation where I wasn't good at it, but we fixed it and we got a great result. We didn't just get the great result we wanted, we got a second order great result as well.
Yeah.
And, I think we can all think of examples where cross-functional, call them teams, the process of bringing people together from across the organisation doesn't work as well as we need them to do. And I tell some personal stories in the book. Some of my experiences of the healthcare system, where you need different parts of the healthcare system working together on a family member's behalf. And this wasn't about me, but a family member. And in the early days, it failed too often. I don't think it's an accident that Amy Edmondson, has done a lot of her work in the healthcare sector.
Yes.
It's where we need it to work. People's lives depend on it working.
Yes.
I've seen it break down too often, but I've also seen it get much better over the years, which is very encouraging. Back to the question, flat organisations create opportunities for teaming, but you've got to learn how to get good at it.
Yes.
And when teams don't just form but disband, you've got to make sure that you haven't lost all that they created in the disbanding, that the learning is still going somewhere and so on. So there's still some fundamentals that need, buzzwords are great, flat organisations are great buzzwords, but there are some fundamentals that still need to be attended to if you're going to be successful in the longer run.
Yeah. You brought this out. It's all great having nice words that sound great, but I think really needs to think about the, as you put it, the second and third order effects of a lot of things.
Yeah. I try to describe things in as plain language as I can for for the book's intended organisation. I'm not speaking down to anybody at all.
No.
As Benjamin kindly said in his foreword, I respect the reader's intelligence. But I try not to use buzzwords. I try not to make unreasonable assumptions either. Take people through step by step. Hopefully, none of the leaps are so big that people don't follow. There's a theoretical model behind it all, which is quite abstract, and that's its power. But there's enough concrete example, I hope, for people to find it really practical as well. And practical advice not only on how organisations work, but on how actually to have the conversations about the organisations, which is how we actually move them on.
Yeah. It's like the saying, your ability to regulate the system is only good as the model you're using to regulate the system. And I think your book gives a good model in which to have these conversations about, that are abstract enough to have these conversations, but not too abstract that it doesn't make sense. It can't be tangibly put to a context.
Yes. Yeah. And we need leaders engaging on the right challenges. But that then begs the question, well, how do they identify what those challenges are? And by having a model that's not so complicated that you can't get your head around it, but is rich enough that you can apply it at every scale and between scales, and it has enough relationships in it to be interesting. I think something that VSM has highlighted for 50 years now is that organisations need to be good models of their environments, or at least reflect some understanding of their environment. Organisations do reflect some understanding of the environment. The question is whether that's a good one or not.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think we can't understate the importance of understanding the external environment.
Yeah.
How much that shapes us, and we shape that.
Yes.
And your point around leaders using it to identify the real challenges. Often we hear reductive or easy to point at problems. So if an organisation's got a problem, I roll my eyes because they go, "Oh, we've got a culture problem, or we've got this problem."
I actually point one specifically. That makes my eyes roll as well. I mean, it's a great way of sounding clever, but actually not identifying the issue.
Yeah. And they do it all the time. They're just like, they throw it out there.
You hear it in politics, don't you? I mean, it is literally a political answer. It's a great way of actually not actually taking any responsibility for anything in a way. So you've got to get to issues that are concrete enough that people can engage with them, not so concrete that you're denying the generative opportunity, the creative opportunity in exploring them as well.
Yeah, and it comes back to another point we mentioned around the relationship between the parts, and the relationship with the external environment, relationship between different entities of the organisation, the relationship between different scales of the organisation, even to the point where we're looking at misattribution of performance measures and those things.
Yeah.
Now, they're stuff that we can tangibly get our hands around. And it's good that we have these models, what you presented in Wholehearted, so that we can get leaders to move away from these tropes and actually get to serious conversations and identify real challenges that they could effectively do something about.
It really elevates the conversation. I mean, I think it's very easy to, if you look at the systems, it's very easy to say, we could make an improvement to how we do the work. We could make an improvement to how we coordinate. We could make an improvement to how we organise, to how we strategise, to how we self-govern, how we contextualise, all the rest of it. But when you start to ask the question, are these things working well enough together? Is every relationship there healthy and productive? I think that's a different level of conversation there. A different level of engagement, and you might be surprised at some of the answers that you get, because, as I said, the pain may not be the source of the problem. There's enough relationships there. I think you could pick on any one relationship and find something to improve. But the beauty of getting people together is that they will talk about what is most important. After exploring this for not for very long, they'll start to home in onto what are the issues that are most important, and then you've got something to work with. Then that could take just literally minutes. We're talking, halfway through the first morning, we are already identifying some real issues about the organisation, the things that we want to do something about. Many practitioners would find helpful, and many leaders certainly would find helpful. I think actually leaders will find this easier to absorb than practitioners, because they're used to having conversations in their organisations. And this is just helping to elevate those conversations. To practitioners, I'm, presenting a quite different kind of approach. It's a dialogic approach, a generative approach, and one that's putting off what they want to start with. That's there's a tension there.
Yeah.
But from those kind of tensions, perhaps someone else will come up with something that, for a particular set of circumstances, works better than either approach does on their own. I think there's opportunity for innovation here. I don't think I've bottomed this out.
No.
I think between the systems world, the complexity world, and the organisation development world, there's something interesting here that I'm digging into. And I think too often those different communities have mistrusted each other.
Yeah, I think as a system thinker and also organisational psychologist, I see the mistrust between a lot of the groups, and you see it now with the rise of complexity science, and it becomes almost the driving of the part of the two, but we're more closely aligned than I think people will like to admit.
Yes.
And actually we benefit from coming together rather than trying to be isolationist.
Yes. I think my book's a real demonstration of the possibility there.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I've solved it all, but I think by putting these three things together, something interesting has come out of it. It's a fresh perspective on something that many people treasure. I treasure, but when you get a fresh perspective on something, that's exciting. And if something new can come out of that, beyond what I've done, then that's fantastic.
I don't think we're ever going to solve the problems. I think, as we start to bring these things together, there's always going to be something else. And that's the same with organisations.
Yeah.
What I like around the terms delivering, discovering, renewing is the fact that it sees the organisation as a living system.
Yes.
And, as the external environment evolves,
yes,
we're still going to renew. So there's going to be things that are...
I call it verbing the nouns of business agility. When we call it delivery, when we call it strategy, these things sound fixed.
Yes.
When we're talking about delivering, discovering, renewal, doing the value creating work, when we're coordinating, when we're organising, when we're strategizing, contextualizing, self-governing, it's already more active, more dynamic. If you bring the multiple scales thing, which VSM has always had, that makes it more interesting. It's more interesting still when you realise there's like this, it's a bit like, it's a bit just a silly analogy, but in quantum theory, how things come in and out of existence.
Yes.
But when we're talking about relationships, those come in and out of existence as well. Some relationships are quite ephemeral. They don't last more than a few hours. But that doesn't mean they were meaningless or useless. And you never know when an informal gathering of people might result in something that gets a life of its own. Actually becomes a viable system in its own right. And that potential has to be interesting. That potential is what I want us to be tapping into.
And I think that's great. But again, that gets enabled by the capacity of the team.
Yes.
And if we're overburdening our teams, then we're removing all that spontaneous interaction that can start to self-organise something that can help the organisation.
But let's not kid ourselves that we'll only fix that by implementing lean or agile. That's getting to the relationship between delivery and coordinating most of all. I mean, it does affect some of the other systems as well, but that's where most of that action is.
Yes.
And if we're not getting those other relationships right as well, that's going to be costing us too.
That's really important that leaders start to look at the relationship between those things rather than those things in isolation.
Yes.
Even broad subjects like culture. People look at culture and strategy in the organisation in isolation to the detriment of everything else. How do we step back and look at it as a whole?
Yes, I think my hesitation there is we look at these things separately. We also can work too much at the level of generalization. Our culture is this, our culture is that. We'd like it to be more of that.
Yes.
And I think you remove some of that danger if we start with the experience and the consequences of that experience, how we'd like things to be different, and what some of the consequences of that would be.
Yeah, I think that's really key and a great point to sort of leave with, and we could carry this on. I knew this would be the problem. There's so much stuff I want to go into, so no doubt I think we're going to have a part two probably later on down the line.
I'll be up for that.
Just tell us about
when the books are out. I pre-released it on LeanPub in March, so it's available in EPUB and PDF formats on LeanPub. More convenient formats, April the 16th is the date we're going for. So it's already available for pre-order on Kindle and Kobo. It should be available for pre-order soon on Apple and Google.
Awesome. And our final question to ask, if you could leave leaders with one key insight from Wholehearted, what would that be?
Oh, I'm torn between thinking relationally and thinking in terms of experience. It's got to be between one of those two. Those are the two things that I think are different about the book. Perhaps the experiential thing is the more important of the two. I think VSM people naturally think in terms of relationships, or at least good VSM people do. The way not to think about VSM is thinking of it as a data flow diagram. That's not what it is. It kind of is, but that's like about 1% of its power. I think the experiential thing is the thing we've got to focus in on, and it's to remember, and I'm borrowing this from other people, but it's everyone's experience is different.
Yes.
It was a shock to me when I recognised that as a manager. When I became senior enough that I intimidated people. I thought I was one of the nice guys, but I was senior enough that people were just intimidated by the title. And it's very easy for two people to have very different impressions of a conversation, for example, when there's that kind of dynamic there.
I think that's fantastic. And what I really like about that is that we make assumptions. We don't really ask those questions to understand what's implicitly held.
Yes.
And once we can make it explicit, we can see the difference between what I believe to be true and what they believe to be true, and we can see how we can close those gaps.
Yes.
Mike, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on Strategy Meets Reality. For those that want to dive deeper, you can find Mike's work on agenda shift. I'll put the links in. You could check out his book Wholehearted when it gets released 16th of April. I'll put the links in there. And thank you for all listening. I hope you found this episode valuable. I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Oh, it's been my pleasure too. Thank you.